Welcome to another episode of Bitches Love Sports. I'm Jazz Monet, your host, and today I get to talk about one of my favorite athletes. A lot of y'all know me as a Cowboys fan. Yes, I love Dak Prescott. I love CeeDee Lamb, but someone else I love almost just as much is one Mr. Caleb Williams. So I've loved Caleb Williams ever since October 9th, 2021, when I was watching the Red River rivalry. Say that 3 times fast. But it's an annual game between Texas and Oklahoma, for those who are not familiar. And living in Austin, of course, I was watching for Texas, just trying to keep up with the local talent and whatnot. And at one point, Texas was up 28-7. Very early on, it kind of felt like it was over for Oklahoma. And next thing you know, Spencer Rattler gets benched. They put in this true freshman, Caleb Williams, and Oklahoma ends up winning 55-48. After this freshman comes in the game, throws for over 200 yards, just puts the team on his back like he was used to it or something. At the time when he was put into the game, it really felt like a desperation move. Like Oklahoma was just kind of phoning it in and like, okay, well, let's see what this other guy has for next time, But Caleb was like, no, not next time, this time. We got this. And I remember doing a podcast episode shortly after that and just being like, yo, I was rooting for Texas, but I saw this dude, Caleb Williams, and oh my God, I'm a fan. And I've been a fan ever since then. So fast forward a couple years and some months, and NCAA Bay is entering the draft. So proud of him. Yeah, if you follow Caleb Williams, he's aspired for a long time to be the number 1 draft pick in the NFL draft. And it looks like that will be the case. But some of the recent headlines are questioning exactly how that's going to happen and where he's going to end up. And I'm not against the questioning, honestly. If you follow me on Twitter, I've been open about the fact that I'm not a fan of him going to the Bears. But a few things have happened recently that have some people wondering if maybe something else is in store for Caleb. Now, there are a few different ways that things could play out. I think people have gotten some things right and some things wrong. So let's talk about it. So pretty much ever since the 2023 NFL regular season ended and the 2024 draft order was announced, people have been assuming that Caleb Williams was going to be the number 1 pick and that the Chicago Bears would draft him, even though they already have a young quarterback in Justin Fields. And we're not talking about a situation where Caleb would be drafted and then in a situation where he'd be sitting behind Justin Fields learning from him. No, the speculation is that Chicago wants to move on from Justin Fields and expects Caleb to take on the starting quarterback role. Now, despite everything that I said about being a Caleb Williams fan and me being very impressed with his gameplay, I have a problem with that for a few reasons. But let me give you some background just to make sure everybody's on the same page and caught up, and then we'll talk about why I have a little bit of an issue both with how the Chicago Bears are treating Justin Fields and also with the assumptions that are being made about Caleb Williams and what he's going to do once he enters the NFL. So one of the major shakeups that happened recently was when the Washington Commanders hired Cliff Kingsbury. Now, Cliff Kingsbury spent the last few seasons as an offensive assistant at USC, where Caleb was the quarterback. So he was one of Caleb's quarterback's coaches. He worked closely with him. And when news of Kingsbury's new role with the Commanders went public, Caleb openly congratulated him on Instagram. So immediately after that, people started speculating about whether or not Caleb might prefer to play for the Commanders, or if the Commanders were hiring Kingsbury as part of a larger plan to somehow trade up or make some kind of deal with the Chicago Bears to ensure that they could draft Caleb Williams instead of the Bears. Now, I want to say early on that Caleb Williams has not said that he would prefer this scenario. The Chicago Bears have not said anything about trading the first round pick. And the Washington Commanders have not actually said anything about making any actual attempts to get the first round pick or to somehow end up with Caleb Williams. This is all speculation. But considering the number of ways that this could actually end up being the case, I do think it's worth discussing because honestly, depending on how it all plays out, it could end up being a win-win-win for everybody. Now, people have been debating about how much leverage Caleb Williams actually has. Personally, I do think that he has a good bit, and I'm actually excited about that for him. Most people discussing the topic are essentially saying that, hey, if Caleb Williams actually makes it public that he doesn't want to go to the Bears, the value of that first round pick will go down. So if the Bears are getting any inclination that Caleb is going to try to work his way into a position with the Washington Commanders, it would be in their best interest to go ahead and cooperate with that request. There are others, however, who are saying that that amount of leverage is really just a myth. It's a fantasy. And that if the Chicago Bears want Caleb Williams, there's really nothing he can do about it. Now, before I go too far down that path, I want to talk about how these rumors actually got started up recently, because you might be wondering, like, okay, well, if nobody actually said that this is a thing they're trying to make happen, then where exactly did this idea come from? One of the most recent sources of this was actually Colin Cowherd. He actually went on his show and said that Caleb Williams did not want to go to the Chicago Bears.
I'm told by NFL executives USC's quarterback is the best quarterback prospect they can remember. Better than Andrew Luck, a five-tool guy. Led the nation in offense despite having only one great teammate the last 2 years. And young quarterbacks overwhelmingly are as good as where they land. I mean, Justin Fields is 10-28. Do you think he'd be 10-28 if he inherited Andy Reid? I don't. The Bears have had one winning season in 11 years. They haven't won a playoff game in 14. They haven't had an offense in the top 15 in the last decade. It is Loserville offensively, and their division looks really, really, really good.
So it's essentially this whole idea that, hey, Caleb Williams is a generational talent, and the Chicago Bears have a terrible track record when it comes to developing quarterbacks. And that's been my issue with the idea of Caleb going to the Chicago Bears from the very beginning. I do think Caleb Williams has the potential to be a generational talent. I do think he's one of the best quarterbacks in the draft. And whether or not he's the best really depends on what you're looking for in a quarterback. And that's something that I don't think is taken into consideration nearly enough. Not everybody is the best fit for every situation. And I think that Caleb actually needs to be somewhere that's going to help him develop. And so it's not so much that people just hate the Bears, it's that people have already seen the Bears not do right by a couple of quarterbacks who came into the league with a lot of hype around their talent and what they could potentially do for an NFL team. And I think people are just especially wary of Caleb ending up being the next one in a string of quarterbacks, especially considering the fact that the coach for the Bears is in a lame duck situation. And that's something that Caleb's camp themselves actually wanted to relay to Colin Cowherd.
So I got a call from the Caleb Williams camp, and they went, whoa, Colin, we don't want to be painted as anti-Chicago, and we don't want to be painted as anti-Bear. And they made it clear to me that they said, listen, we don't want to go to a city that doesn't care. Chicago cares. They're big, loud, they're passionate. They fire coaches all the time. They care. We don't want to go to some Sunbelt place where you tarp off the upper deck. And they did say, there is a path to succeed in Chicago. It's called the Houston Texans. Defensive coach, couple of weapons, cap space, good pick. They mentioned they got a second pick. There's a bunch of good receivers out there. LSU, Washington, they could go get another weapon, and they already have one bona fide number one pick. But it does show you the reality of Caleb Williams, and I've got sympathy for the athlete. Start naming all the quarterbacks whose first spot was a disaster, and they resurrected it, and it just went great. And not many of them. And Caleb Williams is great, and all he wants to do is win, and he's super competitive. About my only criticism of Caleb Williams, he gets a little pissy after he loses. He gets very moody. He doesn't like to lose. He is hyper competitive.
So there's something especially interesting about what Caleb's camp decided to relate to Colin Cowherd. They're like, no, we're not anti-Chicago. We actually think there's a way that we could find success in Chicago. And they basically start listing off all these things, right? But the fact that there has to be this list, to me, lets me know that whether they're going to say it out loud or not, they do have some reservations about Caleb Williams going to Chicago. Because I think the need to list those things means that you don't really expect Chicago to just kind of do those things as a natural part of how they usually operate. And if you look at their track record, that's a reasonable concern to have. So going back to them getting rid of Justin Fields in the first place, on paper, it looks like they're wanting to get rid of Justin Fields because he hasn't produced results. But in reality, Justin Fields just hasn't really been in the best situation for him to produce results. And the Bears have received a lot of criticism, not even just recently, but going back to honestly at least the beginning of the season, for not setting up Justin Fields for success. Yes, he has dealt with some injuries, but some of the decisions and moves made by the Bears do seem to have done maybe more harm than good. So, for example, compared to some other quarterbacks that seem to have developed really well and fit really well with their offense, like, for example, Jordan Love, Justin Fields wasn't given that same opportunity. He was thrust into a starting role in week 3 of his rookie year. Soon after that, they fire Matt Nagy, bring in Eberflus, who's a defensive head coach, not an offensive coach. And Eberflus brings in Luke Getsy. Now, Luke Getsy had a lot of buzz around him because he worked with Aaron Rodgers, but let's be real. There's a big difference between coaching an experienced future Hall of Famer versus the guy who's really still trying to find his footing in the NFL. And Getsy had never developed an offense or called plays before. So essentially, they rushed Fields into a starting role, then brought in a defensive head coach who brought in a coordinator who was even newer in his role than Justin Fields was in his. That's a lot for Justin Fields to have to overcome. And right now, with Eberflus being on the last year of his contract and no evidence that he's going to get an extension or a renewal, it looks like Caleb Williams is coming in and being set up for a very similar situation. And it would be different if the Bears had a history of putting their quarterbacks in good situations or of finding good coaches or finding the right players to put around their quarterback so that they can have success. On the contrary, the Bears have this history of going through quarterbacks like Kleenex. And if that weren't enough, even before all this happened, earlier this season, there were already seeds being planted that Caleb might be a little bit picky about what team he goes to once he goes pro. Yes, he declared for the NFL draft at the very last minute, having people wondering if he was going to declare at all. But even before that, in an article that appeared in GQ magazine, Caleb's been in there twice, by the way. It's pretty good for a college quarterback. But in the one that was published this past fall, his father had a quote that kind of laid out what their standards were and why. And this was all based on a conversation that Carl, Caleb's dad, had with Caleb's former head coach, Lincoln Riley. This is what Mr. Williams had to say, according to GQ. He said, "The funky thing about the NFL draft process is he'd almost be better off not being drafted than being drafted first. The system is completely backwards," he says. "The way the system is constructed, you go to the worst possible situation. The worst possible team, the worst organization in the league, because of their desire for parity, gets the first pick. So it's the gift and the curse. I mean, I've talked to Archie Manning. His career was shot because he went to a horrible organization. I've talked to Lincoln Riley, and Kyler Murray struggled because of where he was drafted. Baker Mayfield struggled mightily because of where he was drafted. The organizations matter." Then the article goes on, and there's a break in case of emergency option that Carl is keeping in his mind. He's got 2 shots at the apple, he says. So if there's not a good situation, the truth is he can come back to school. Now, that has since been debunked in a sense. And I'm going to discuss it more later because there's another clip that I have that brings it up. But it is true that Caleb can't go back to school and play football. But if he really, really wanted to, he could go back to school and just finish his education. So I thought it was really significant that he said that he talked to Lincoln Riley. Because honestly, when it comes to quarterbacks looking good in college and then going to the pros and struggling, Lincoln Riley would definitely know all about that. And so if he keeps in touch with a lot of the quarterbacks that he's worked with who have gone pro, then he's probably got some details on how exactly that happened and why. You know, if you think about those names, Kyler Murray, Baker Mayfield, even Jalen Hurts, despite the success that he's seen in the pros, he's had his fair share of struggles. All of those quarterbacks looked really good in college and came to the pros and needed development. And that's what concerns me about Caleb. So yes, I am a Caleb Williams fan, but I'm not unrealistic. As a matter of fact, this is what I said after the end of Caleb's 2022 season about his gameplay and the possibility of him being drafted. So this is a good topic because I'm curious about your thoughts on this. But when I watch Caleb Williams, I feel like in the system he's in, he does some phenomenal things, right? But based on how I see him approach the game, assuming his gameplay stays the same, I think him coming into the NFL, he's not going to have the impact that some people think he'll have. I think he's going to have to take some time to adjust because there are so many plays where I feel like I'm watching him and it's like one read, pocket is collapsing, I'm going to take the ball and run with it or just do something unpredictable, right? Mm-hmm. Which I feel like a lot of NFL coaches, that's going to piss them off, you know? 100%. And so it's like, I feel like a lot of people are expecting him to come into the NFL and be just as impactful as he's been in college, but he's actually going to need a little bit of time. Once again, assuming his game stays the same or his trajectory stays the same, I feel like he's going to need a little bit of time to develop and actually learn a different way to approach the game in order to actually be effective at this level. Yeah. And it's just like, I guess the reason why it frustrates me is because I do love Caleb Williams. And what I don't want is for people to be like, oh, he's going to come in, he's going to be running quarterback, he's going to do this, he's going to do that, he's going to be great. And then he comes in and he struggles his first season or maybe his first 2 seasons. And then people are like, oh, he's trash, he's a bust, he's garbage. That's essentially what happened with Jalen Hurts, right? He came in and people were like, oh, what the F is this? Like, there were even people who were like, why did we even draft him? And then it was his third season before you started to see like, okay, he needed a little bit of time. He needed some coaching. He needed some development. He needed some direction. And for me, I see Caleb Williams kind of having that same trajectory as far as like time it takes him to be really impactful because of what he's dealing with. Now that could all change next season. You know, maybe they add a little bit of structure. Maybe they get some better players around him to where he doesn't have to pick up the ball and just do something heroic with it. But the way he's playing now, his trajectory now, that's what I foresee. I don't see the way he plays translating to the NFL in a way that makes him just come in and just make this huge splash and turn like a regular team into like a winning team. Now, one thing I will say is that whole one read thing, I do think that Caleb has gotten a lot better about that. There were multiple times this past season where I was watching him and it even looked like he was trying to hold himself back. Like he felt that urge to pick up the ball and run and he's like, no, I'm going to go through my progressions. I'm going to figure this out. But you can tell that he still needs a little bit of development just because of the kind of, I guess you could call it buffering in a sense, that you'll see whenever he does go into that mode where he's trying to go through his progressions. And then there's also the fact that most college quarterbacks, just in general, do not see good defenses in college as often as they're going to see them in the NFL. And so I think what a lot of people are thinking when it comes to Caleb being the number one pick and coming in and being ready to just save an organization is they're looking at his highlights, they're looking at his ability to improvise, they're looking at all the natural instincts and natural abilities that he has, and they're thinking that that's what they're going to see on the field in the pros. And I do think you'll see some of that, yes, but I don't think you're going to see it nearly as often, and I don't think it's going to be nearly as effective. And honestly, I think Caleb Williams knows that. And yes, him having better offensive linemen and better weapons around him will make a difference. But one, we have to ask ourselves, are the Chicago Bears going to put that around him? And two, does that mean he won't need development at all? This past week, this whole situation regarding Caleb, what leverage he does or doesn't have, and whether he'll end up with the Bears or with the Commanders, ended up being a big topic on Get Up. And initially, I was going to just write down some of the points that they made and respond to them. But I ended up writing down so many points. I was like, okay, let's just do a watch along situation and I'll respond as the points come up. So here we go.
Okay, so all signs point to Washington wanting Caleb Williams. Let's live in a world, Mike T, because we talked about this morning and it's fascinating. Let's live in a world where Caleb Williams does want to go to D.C. We don't know that. It should be pointed out. He hasn't said that publicly. But in a world where Caleb Williams does want to go to D.C. and not Chicago, if you're the general manager of the Bears, tell me how this goes.
Okay, first of all, I've been watching all week reading, and we got a couple of things wrong, so let's clear it up. First of all, Caleb Williams, you don't have nearly the leverage that some people here think you do. First of all, I checked with the league office. He has petitioned to move on to the NFL. They have never revoked that. He cannot go back to college. Secondly, if the four of us represent Caleb Williams, everything we would be thinking about is how quickly do we get to the next deal, which for him will be $55, $60 million a year. So the NIL money is nice and really important for other players. So State Farm commercials, million here, whatever, that's fine. But Caleb Williams, you want to get that clock going ASAP to get to the next contract because that's where the big money is. So he's a really good player, but he has been sacked 83 times, and typically sacks carry over to the NFL, Greeny. So if Chicago wants him, I call up Caleb Williams and say, start looking for your apartments because you could be a Bear in March, April, May, June, July, August. You have no leverage. You're a Bear.
So what you're
So that comment about sacks carrying over to the NFL, honestly, that to me is one of the reasons why if Caleb does have any leverage, he should want to exercise it. And even if the leverage isn't what we think it is, I do still think that he has some. It may not be in the form of him going back to school, but I do think that him making it clear what he expects from the Chicago Bears, and really, honestly, that list could apply to any organization. By Caleb's camp reaching out to Colin Cowherd, they were essentially saying, hey, this is what Caleb needs in order to be happy in a situation. And so I feel like at minimum, the Bears would be smart to take heed. And if they choose not to, and Caleb starts to express that he's unhappy, Well, hey, the standards for his happiness have already been put out there. It would be really hard for them to paint him as some sort of dramatic diva who's just being picky and causing trouble when he's basically made public what he wants in order to feel like he has a potential to succeed in a situation.
Telling me is that if the Bears decide he's their guy, there is next to nothing he can do about it.
There's nothing he could not next to. There is zero. You are a Bear, end of story.
Okay, so it's a.
First of all, this is America. There's always something that you can do. You may not like your choices, but there's always something. And honestly, I don't think Caleb would decide to just go back and finish his education, but I could almost see that happening. And I'm going to tell you why at the end, but I could almost see that happening if it came down to something that he really felt that he needed to do to avoid a situation where he was being set up for failure.
Really interesting conversation, because we've been sitting here talking about that and the NIL money and all that. Now, here's my only pushback on that. If I'm Caleb Williams, you know who's not going to get $60 million? Mitch Trubisky, Zach Wilson, Sam Darnold, probably Justin Fields, or he's certainly going to have to work for it in an entirely different way, because as important as getting the clock started is getting it started in the right place where you have a chance to show how good you are so that you become, even Justin Herbert, who hasn't done any high-level winning. There was no question they were giving him his deal, and Burrow and Allen and all these other guys. If he winds up getting drafted into a really bad situation, and the Bears situation right now looks better than it has in a while, but there are major reasons for concern.
Yep.
Then you never get to that $60 million.
So let me push back on your pushback.
I'm so glad that Greeny made that point, because that's the part that people don't seem to be thinking about here. Everybody seems to be like fast forwarding in their minds to when Caleb Williams is a generational talent and making a lot of money. And the assumption is that he just wants to hurry up and get in the league so he can hurry up and get to that part of his career. But we've seen how many quarterbacks end up not getting to that part of their career at all. And by that part, I mean the part where they're making the $50 to $60 million that a lot of people assume that they're going to make eventually when they get drafted. And it's because they end up in situations where they don't experience the type of success that lends itself to the kind of bargaining that you have to do in order for a club to pay you that much. And I was watching this and I was like, how could he possibly push back on this?
Just, hey, we got Shane Waldron, we got DJ Moore. To your point, we are a better franchise, but the bottom line is you're a Bear because we say you're a Bear and you have no options.
To me, that's not pushback. To me, and keep in mind that during this conversation, Tannenbaum is supposed to be playing the general manager role. And to me, that's not pushback on the idea that Caleb, has to think about what he needs to do to set himself up for getting 50 to 60 million. To me, that's saying, hey, accept the fact that you just might not get there. And if we say that you're a Chicago Bear, then you just are. And you just need to deal with that. And I feel like this is also a good time to point out that what Caleb's dad said about the draft being for parity in the league, he's absolutely correct. When the draft was instituted, which was, I want to say in the 30s, I know it was the Philadelphia Eagles who started the conversation. Basically, before that, there wasn't a draft. And some teams just had a harder time because of their facilities or resources or pay, because this was also before the salary cap was set up the way that it is now. Some teams just had a harder time getting the good players. And so they had a harder time competing. And so basically the owners came together and they were like, okay, let's institute this draft process so that, the talent among teams will be a little bit more even. The games will be more competitive. And if the games are more competitive, they'll be more fun to watch. We'll have more fans and we'll make more money. That's where it all came from. The whole idea of, well, what if some teams don't develop their players the right way? What if some teams don't have, the best in terms of resources? What if they, what about making sure that all teams have the best coaches? What about all that? That wasn't part of the discussion, really.
That, at the end of the day, that's the end of the day. That's what he's telling us. Marcus, you've heard all this conversation. You've obviously been a part of it on NFL Live and everything else. What's your take on all this at the very top of the NFL draft?
I mean, look, I hear what Mike T is saying, but do you really want a disgruntled quarterback to walk into your building the first day after you draft him? That's number one. Number two is when you have a position of power like Chicago has, you try to leverage the fact that Caleb Williams doesn't want to play with you. It's hard to identify quarterbacks, and everybody has talked about how he could potentially be generational, and they see traits, a lot of traits of the best quarterbacks that we have in the league. So I get it. I would understand the stance from Ryan Poles of not wanting to move or not wanting to capitulate to what Caleb Williams wants. But we've seen this movie before with guys not wanting to be places. We understand that if that is the potential of him walking into a building and everybody in that organization understanding that he really doesn't want to be here, where does that put the Bears?
That's right.
So this was actually another reason why I thought it was really smart for Caleb's camp to send the message that they sent to Colin Cowherd. If they have a list of, hey, these are the kinds of things that Caleb is looking for in terms of what he thinks can take this particular organization and make it successful, or what he thinks he needs in order to be set up for success, then it's not just him being a disgruntled player. It's him once again saying, hey, this organization has a history of not setting their quarterbacks up for success. They're doing the same thing to me, and I'm not standing for it. Now, I honestly don't see Caleb playing that disgruntled player role, but I'm going to let Jeff Saturday say what he has to say, and then I'm going to tell you why.
Right? Like, I get it, and you can force his hand, but we've seen this organization and franchise try to find an identity over the last 5 or so years. They've tried to make moves. They kept Eberflus. Ryan Poles brought in as a GM. We've seen the up and down situation of a quarterback. So I hear you, Mike T. And yeah, you have no choice if you Caleb Williams potentially. But you know the choice you have is to go in that building and tell them every day, I do not want to be here. I don't want to play here. And the type of turmoil that's going to create, I don't think it's worth having a guy with maybe a little less talent that can still play at a high level that wants to play for the Chicago Bears.
And let me.
That last comment actually kind of made me laugh a little bit, just because it's like, well, instead of taking Caleb, maybe they should take somebody with a little less talent who they think would want to play for the Bears. And I'm like, well, what we're discussing is the fact that Caleb might not want to go to the Bears because they have a history of not developing their quarterbacks and not setting them up for success. So why do you think another quarterback would want to go there? And why are we not talking about what those quarterbacks want? You know, it's like, maybe instead of being like, hey, Caleb Williams is not going to stand for this. But, Drake May and Jaden Daniels, they'll be totally fine going into a situation where they're not going to be developed properly. I'm like, what? Maybe we should spend just a little bit more time talking about the shortcomings of Chicago instead of just focusing on the fact that Caleb doesn't like it. We shouldn't be talking like it's okay for any quarterback to have their career start off in this kind of turmoil.
Let me say this too. It is a time where, and to Swagoo's point, I agree with this. If you walk in and say, okay, you have to be a Bear. Well, I don't want to be a Bear. Eberflus might lose his job. Like, they don't want to play in a world of uncertainty and distraction. Poles doesn't want that. Eberflus doesn't want that, because both of them could be moving out just as quickly. We've seen this tape on replay, right? We saw it with Trubisky. Then we see it with Fields. Like, this is not new for the Bears in this organization. And so I do think there's more leverage. And again, maybe not, I'm going to get myself drafted somewhere else. But let me tell you, they can. There's a saying in football: you can make me practice, you can't make me practice hard. Like, that dude could walk in and be like, all right, I'm here, but I'm not going to do it. That's more of a distraction for this team than anything else.
So I don't see Caleb causing that kind of distraction. Now, I'm going to preface what I'm about to say with this. There are some athletes who I like because of what I see from them on the field or on the court or whatever they do. And then there are some athletes that I like because of who they are as people. And I actually pay attention to their interviews and their quotes and their posts and what kind of people they seem to be. And Caleb Williams, for me, is definitely one of the latter. And so everything that I've ever heard him say about what his goals are and what his work ethic is like and what he aims to be in terms of the role of leader that he wants to play on this team, I don't see him just causing that kind of distraction or being that uncooperative. I really do believe that whatever situation he ends up in, he's going to do everything in his power to make it a successful situation for himself as well as everybody on his team. So I think in order for Caleb Williams to get to the point where he's like, I'm just not going to practice, like, the Chicago Bears would pretty much have to look him in his face and be like, nah, we're not putting weapons around you. We're not getting you a coach that works well with you. We're not going to make sure you're in a good system. Like, you better get out there and save the day or it ain't going to be saved. Like, I feel like they would have to be that defiant in their willingness to help him out and set him up for success, for him to just be like, all right, F it, I'm done. But until something like that happens, I really do see him putting in a lot of work on his own, because that's something that he already does. Wherever he goes, whether something happens and he ends up going to a place where he does end up sitting behind a quarterback for a while, he's going to put a lot of effort into his own self-development and his own athletic development and understanding the game at a pro level. If there's anything that he can do to help his teammates, he's going to do that. If there's any conversations that he can have with the powers that be, whether it's coaches, front office people, or anything that can help them get on the same page as far as what the team needs and what he needs, he's going to do that. All those things are 100% going to come first for Caleb Williams before he walks in and says, all right, I'm just not going to practice hard, or, okay, I'm just going to sit out, or whatever it is that people are thinking that he might do if the Bears draft him. So it's definitely a situation where Caleb has leverage in the sense that he's a generational talent. He's put out his list of requirements. He said, hey, this is how I think the situation could go. I'm not anti-Bear. I just want to go to a place where they set me up for success. And so it's really up to the Bears to prove that they're not as bad of an organization as everybody's thinking they are. It's really up to them to say, okay, this time around, we're going to get it right. And if they don't, that's when things are going to become a problem. That's when you're going to start seeing the distractions. And no matter how they might try to put it on Caleb Williams, I think with everything that we're hearing now, everything that we're hearing already, it's going to be really, really hard to blame him and make it seem like that whole situation is his fault.
Right, we should make it clear. He has never said any of these.
No.
I know. I'm envisioning someone watching this and all of a sudden walking away saying, oh, I hate Caleb Williams. That's not what's going on. But we're just speculating about what he could do. Go ahead, Marcus.
Here's the thing, too. Like, Chicago's a great place to play football. Yeah. They've just been abysmal as far as the organization. Like, being a Chicago Bear, there's a sense of pride and some stuff that come along with that could take you into another stratosphere if you Caleb Williams and go in there and play at a high level, which everybody thinks you can. The speculation, and I'm glad you pointed it out, G, about people listening and watching us right now, is the fact that if that was to come to pass, if he didn't want to be in Chicago because he's looking at the past history of the franchise and organization, which I agree with Mike T, is in a better situation. But there is also the elephant in the room that his quarterback's coach just went to the team with the second overall pick with a new head coach, and that's trying to start a new era as well. So
in his hometown,
the Washington Commanders, in my opinion, would be more incentivized to do the things that Mike T that a number 2 team with the second pick wouldn't need to do. You got new.
And honestly, I think that's the biggest point of this whole conversation. I think this whole conversation with the Chicago Bears and everything has taken over front and center just because I think that's something people have been thinking about for a long time. You know, ever since the quote with Caleb's dad came out and people look at what's happened with Justin Fields, I think a lot of people have been wondering, like, okay, what's going to happen with this number 1 pick? Are they going to draft Caleb? What does that mean for Justin Fields? And how are things going to go differently for Caleb Williams than they did for Justin Fields? So I think that part of the conversation has taken over. But honestly, I think if there was a reason for Caleb and the Commanders and the Bears to try to figure out how to make this whole situation work, it's the fact that the Bears, they have some things to work out besides quarterback. Whether they keep Justin Fields or draft somebody else, they have some things in terms of coaching and personnel and roster development and overall culture. They have things to work out in order for that team to be successful. Caleb Williams is not going to go in there and be able to just save them automatically with his arm. So if they're able to go back a spot or 2 and get more picks or more assets in exchange for that, that's still a win for them. Honestly, if you think about it. Whether you think Jaden Daniels or Drake May or anybody else is actually better than Caleb Williams in reality, any of those guys are good picks. And Justin Fields is also a good quarterback. If the Bears do what they're supposed to do, they can set up their organization for success. The Commanders are in a situation, however, where they are really trying to establish and solidify the brand. It's changed a lot over the past few years, and the fans are looking for a successful team. They're looking for progress. Apparently, the organization is looking for a new stadium. Having a hometown hero like Caleb Williams come and lead their professional team could actually be a good move, even if Caleb doesn't come in and like immediately take them to the playoffs. Just having him there and having him connect with the community could actually be a good move for the Commanders in terms of their branding. And it could also be a good move for Caleb for the same reasons. Having him go to an area where he's familiar, where people might support him and show him love, even if he's not 100% the best quarterback next season, just because of the connection that he has to the area. And then with him going to a place where there's a coach who's familiar with him and a coach who was actually used to developing quarterbacks somewhat, that actually does sound like a better situation for him, both on the field and off the field. So me being a Caleb Williams fan, I'm like, yes, I would love to see that happen for him. So the Bears can keep their quarterback or draft anybody, just make that trade for the number 1 pick, get some more assets and use them wisely. The Commanders get a quarterback that the community can rally behind, and Caleb Williams ends up in a situation where he's better off in terms of his potential for development and being set up for success. So that's what I meant earlier when I said this could potentially be a win-win-win for everybody, because in that scenario, people are going to say what they want about trading away for the number 1 pick. And once we actually see how Caleb fits in with the Commanders, people are going to talk about their pros and cons. But on its surface, as far as this point in relationship to the season, it does look like that could be a win-win-win for everybody. And I can definitely understand why Caleb and anybody else involved might be behind the scenes seeing what they can do to make that happen.
New ownership in Joe Harris. You got Magic Johnson, a part of that group. You got a new organization that's trying to reface themselves. They may be willing to give up a little bit more to go up and get Caleb Williams than your conventional team that's sitting there at number 2, regardless of how much they're being asked to do it for.
That's right. It doesn't have to be how desperate he is not to go to Chicago as much as it is he may really want to go to Washington. The reality is he grew up in D.C. He went to Gonzaga High School right there in Washington. And so maybe he would prefer that to go there with Cliff Kingsbury. Yeah.
But Greeny, the inverse of that, and we saw this in Carolina, one of the reasons they got fired, it wasn't Bryce Young, it's they passed on C.J. Stroud. So Drake May or Jay Daniels may be a B+, but if Caleb Williams turns out to be an A, Chicago will never, But
that's true every year. But the reality is the generational quarterbacks wind up being generational about 50% of the time. And most of that is going to be based upon the situation into which they walk. Now, again, I'll point out that the Bears' history with quarterbacks is abysmal. If you're a middle linebacker, that's the place that you want to go. But the other side of it is, like, to your point, they have a true number 1 receiver. They have a great offensive tackle they drafted last year, and they have the 9th pick, so they could take Olu Fashanu from Penn State or Talise Fuaga or one of these other offensive tackles at number 9. You could have he could be a really good situation. This is less about Chicago, although I hate the uncertainty of their coaching situation.
That's the deal.
Than it is about going to Washington.
Yeah, 100% it's the lame duck coach situation that concerns you, right? If you don't know that guy's going to be there, so if he's not there, the whole Waldron conversation is out the door as well, right?
But Jeff, the rebuttal to that is like, hey, Caleb, like, we're building this around you. Like, we're going to get the best situation.
I know. They said the same thing to Mitch Trubisky and Justin Fields, and look how that worked out. I don't like this plan at all.
I don't like this plan at all either. Even though the Bears might say like, hey, we're going to do this and that, but their track record shows that they're actually not. It really doesn't sound like going to the Bears would be the best situation for Caleb or any new quarterback, honestly. I really do think that the Bears should, if they're going to make all these changes anyway and change the way that they operate anyway, it would be worth it to give Justin Fields a fair shot. At least you've already seen what he looks like in the NFL. You don't have to wonder how his college skills are going to translate. We've seen that he can be impactful. We've seen that he can be a good quarterback. We just need to put him in a situation where he can just do that consistently. That's all. Now, as far as Caleb, like I said earlier, I do believe that whatever leverage he does have, whatever conversations he can have behind the scenes, I do believe that he's going to have them. And I say that largely because of some of the things that he said during the speech when he accepted the Heisman.
The journey really started when I was 10, and the season ended, and I had to turn my equipment in. And there's one thing that I vividly remember is telling my dad in the car ride home that this is what I wanted to do for my career. I wanted to be a football player. I wanted to be a quarterback. I loved it. I loved everything about it. Fast forward a couple years later, I'm crying in a hotel room, and many of you have probably seen me cry after a loss. My team and I just lost a national championship, and I didn't get the chance to play. My coach told me I was too small. That night, a fire ignited in me. That night, I decided to play quarterback and not only be playing quarterback, but to be the best quarterback. I wanted to impact the game. I wanted to share the ball with all my teammates. And if you know me and my dad, very plan-based. We stayed up all night putting together a plan. And the journey/plan went like this. 5:30 a.m., breakfast club workouts. We also had 6:30 in the p.m., lift, running, conditioning, getting bigger, stronger, and faster. We had nutritionists, sleep patterns, sports psychologists, coaching experts, and learning and playing the game. The more I learned, the more I wanted.
And so that's the thing. He said at 10 years old, he went to his dad and said that he wanted to be a quarterback and that he wanted to be one of the best because he didn't want to ever be told that he was too small or too anything to have the job of quarterback again. And so essentially, from the time he was old enough and had enough awareness to even express a modicum of autonomy, he dedicated that to being the best quarterback he could possibly be. And I just have a hard time believing that a kid who at the age of 11 was doing workouts at 5:30 a.m. and at the age of 15 got an apartment closer to his school to make it easier for him to go to the school that he wanted to go to play football, would get into his early 20s and then just all of a sudden start leaving things to chance and letting other people make decisions that dictate the odds of success or failure in his future. So hearing him say things like that and reading the articles that I've read about him and hearing what his dad has said about him and his work ethic and his dedication to being the best that he can possibly be, and yes, seeing how emotional that he gets after some of these losses, I do absolutely believe that he's going to do everything in his power in order to end up in the best situation possible. And so that might be having conversations with the powers that be to see how he can end up in Washington. It might be having some honest conversations with the front office in Chicago about what he needs in order to be successful. It might, like I said earlier, even mean him sitting out a year, finishing his education, and waiting until things line up a little bit better for him and what he wants. I know that might sound crazy to some people, but I really do think that if he were led to believe that that course of action could lead to a better situation and a better future for him in the long run, he would absolutely do it. Now, I, like the folks on Get Up, am just speculating. There's a lot that has to happen between now and the NFL draft. And we've seen how much things can get shaken up between free agency, combines, things that come out during interviews, so on and so forth. So we'll have to see. Ultimately, you know how I am about my faves. I love Caleb Williams. So wherever he ends up being drafted, whatever team he goes to, I'm going to be a fan. So we'll definitely keep an eye on this situation and whatever headlines come out in the future, because I'm interested in seeing how this goes. But in the meantime, if you like this video and you like content like this, please hit that like button. Make sure you share the video, subscribe if you haven't, and don't forget to turn those notifications on. This has been another episode of Bitches Love Sports. I'm Jazz Monet, and I'm out.